Hi everyone, I'm Helen from Susan's family. Today, I'm sharing with you to the light Haze shawl. For this electronic tutorial, you can search en.susuddiy.com on the website to view. The shawl consists of the collar, the main piece, the bordure, the Chinese frogs and buttons. Start by working the collar. Once completed, pick up stitches along one side to knit the main piece. Finally, work the bordure around the edges of the collar and the main piece. Lastly, make and attach the Chinese frogs and buttons. Let's start by learning how to knit the collar. Here, you'll need 2 colors. Work back and forth in rows, changing colors every 2 rows. While working, increase or decrease on one side. This will create an arc. Below, I'll explain the knit technique. First, cast on using color 1. Please watch the demonstration. First, take out the working yarn. Make a slip knot with the yarn. Unless there's a special case, leave about 10 centimeters at the beginning. This makes it convenient for weaving in the ends later. This is the cable cast on. After completing this, begin working. For the first few rows, apart from knit, purl, and M1L, this also includes 2 types of slip stitch pattern. The methods for both types of slip stitches pattern are the same. These stitches will work 3 rows. The first row requires working purl or knit. The following 2 rows are worked slip stitches. Now, please watch me demonstrate the specific method. First, work the first row of the chart. These are all knit stitches. Everyone, complete these. I've already completed this. The number of stitches in the sample is not for reference. Next, work the second row. This row has slip stitch pattern symbol. It corresponds to the first row of the symbol. You need to knit this row. According to the chart, this row is all knit stitches. Knit this row to completion. After completing this, move on to the third row. You'll need to use color 2 for this. Tie the yarn tail of color 2 with the yarn of color 1. Then start by knitting 1 stitch. Next, work 1 M1L. Continue with 2 more knit stitches. Proceed down to the position of slip stitch pattern symbol. This is the second row of the symbol. You need to work the slip stitch. Place the working yarn on the wrong side of the fabric. Then slip stitch purlwise to the right-hand needle. After completing this, knit 1 stitch following the knit symbol. Following are the slip stitch pattern symbol. Knit the stitches following the knit symbols accordingly. At the position of the slip stitch pattern symbols, work the slip stitches. Finish this row. After completing this, continue with row 4. Still using color 2. Start with knitting 3 stitches. Following are the slip stitch pattern symbol. Here corresponds to the 3rd row of the symbol. Also, work the slip stitch. After completing, next stitch is the slip stitch pattern symbol. This corresponds to the 1st row of the symbol. You need to knit, purl the stitch corresponding to the chart here. Following are the slip stitch pattern symbol. Simultaneously, this is the 3rd row of the corresponding stitch technique. Work the slip stitches. From here on, everyone should follow the method as indicated in the charts. Complete this row. Knit the last stitch. The 4th row is completed. Knit the 5th row next. Switch to color 1 and work. Refer to the chart until you reach the slip stitch pattern symbol. When you get to the corresponding position, this is the 2nd row of the symbol. Knit the slip stitches. Continue following the chart to complete this row. After completing, knit the 6th row. Start with 3 knits. Following the slip stitch pattern symbol, purl 1 stitch according to the chart. 1 slip stitch. 1 purl. Continue knitting according to the chart using this method. After completing, the sixth row is done. For the first row of the slip stitch pattern, you need to knit it. For the second and third rows of the symbol, knit the slip stitches. The remaining rows will also use the SKP. After finishing everything, you need to bind off. Let's now demonstrate how to do the SKP and the method for binding off. Please watch the demonstration. Slip knit pass, also known as the SKP. When knitting, the right hand needle slip one stitch knitwise. Then knit next one stitch. Then, use the left hand needle to pick up the slip stitch. Pass it over the stitch on the left. The SKP is completed. You can see that the right side loop is above the left side loop. I'll demonstrate this again. The right hand needle slip one stitch knitwise. Then knit one stitch. Then pass the slipped stitch over the stitch on the left. That's how you do the SKP. Binding off while knitting the edge. Generally, after finishing garter stitch, you can use this method on the right side. When binding off in this situation, knit 2 stitches first. Then, pick up the first stitch with the left hand needle and pass it over the second stitch. This binds off one stitch. Continue by knitting one more stitch. Then, pick up the first stitch with the left hand needle and pass it over the next stitch. This binds off another stitch. I'll continue to bind them all off. Each time, I bind off by knitting. Now there's only one loop left. Pull up the loop. Then leave a yarn tail and fasten off. The tail length depends on the specifics of the fabric. Usually, just leaving about 10 centimeters is enough. Thread the yarn tail through the loop. Then pull tight. This is the method for bind off. Regardless of the binding off method, the method for securing the end of the thread can be referred to as demonstrated here. And once everything is completed, if you're not specifically leaving a long yarn tail for sewing, these short tails, on the wrong side, follow the fabric's texture and weave in the end. Try not to affect the right side texture. When weaving in the yarn tail, you can weave the entire yarn tail in. Moving forward, refer to the charts to complete the collar. Now let's work on the main piece, on the wrong side of the collar. Along the straighter edge of the collar. Use color 1 to pick up the corresponding number of stitches. Then work back and forth in rows, changing colors every 2 rows. Here, start the main piece without increase or decrease stitches. Later, you'll need to decrease on both sides. The new stitch technique used here is K2 tog. Also, perform bind off at the beginning of some rows. The bind off is the same as before. However, after binding off some stitches, continue knitting. The method is identical to bind off on the regular garment's underarm. Next, let's explain the bind off method with the underarm bind off method. First, learn the stitch and the bind off technique. Then, combine it with the chart to knit. Please watch the demonstration. Knit 2 stitches together. Shorten to K2 tog. When knitting, the right hand needle insert from left to right into both loops in once. Work 1 knit stitch. That completes the K2 tog. You can see that the left loop is above the right loop. I'll demonstrate again. Insert the needle from left to right through these 2 loops. Then work 1 knit stitch together. That's how you do K2 tog. I'll use this sample to demonstrate the technique. At the beginning of the first row, you need to bind off a few stitches. Refer to the chart for the specific number of stitches. The number of bind off symbols indicates how many stitches to bind off. Here, I need to bind off 4 stitches consecutively. If there are many stitches to bind off consecutively, we can separate them with stitch markers first. Start binding off. The first stitch can be worked as a slip stitch, or it can be worked as a knit stitch. Here, I work a slip stitch. Then knit 1 stitch. Next, I pass the first stitch over the second stitch. That bind off 1 stitch. Unless there are special instructions. On the right side, you bind off by knitting. Continue with 1 more knit. Bind off 1 stitch. Continue binding off while knitting. Keep going until there's only 1 loop on the right of the marker. I have 2 loops left here. And I need to bind off 1 more stitch. Now, there's only 1 loop on the right of the marker, which is the 4th stitch loop. We need to bind this stitch off as well. So, I'll knit one more and bind it off. The following stitch, which is next to the last bind off symbol. Here, we just knit the stitch. Note: since the stitch techniques may vary with different patterns, this stitch needs to be knit according to the chart. After knitting, bind off the fourth stitch as well. This way, the 4 stitches on the chart are bound off. Continue knitting according to the chart. Remember, next, you should start knitting from the second stitch next to the bind off symbol. Before knitting, you need to slightly tighten this loop to prevent any noticeable holes. There's no special pattern here, so we'll knit all the stitches. Knit this row to completion. Now, the first row is done. Continue with the second row. Work this row on the wrong side. At the beginning, bind off 4 stitches in a row. Use a stitch marker to separate them. Start binding off. The first stitch can be a slip stitch or a purl stitch. Here, I'm doing a slip stitch, then a purl stitch, followed by passing the slipped 1 stitch over the next. That binds off 1 stitch. Work 1 more purl stitch. Bind off 1 stitch. If there are no special instructions on the wrong side, you'll be purling and binding off. Continue purling and binding off. Keep going until there's only 1 stitch left to the right of the marker. Here we bind off 1 more stitch. Now there's only 1 stitch left to the right of the marker, which is the 4th stitch's loop. Bind off this stitch as well. So purl and bind off 1 more stitch. The following stitch, which is adjacent to the last bind off symbol. On the wrong side, we purl this stitch. Bind off the 4th stitch. When actually crocheting, the specific stitch technique for this stitch should follow the chart. This binds off the 4 stitches on the chart. Continue following the chart. Note: you should start with the second stitch next to this bind off symbol. Before crocheting, gently tighten this loop to prevent any noticeable holes. There's no special pattern here, so we'll work all purl stitches. Now we've covered the second row. Next, bind off on the right side. Using the same method as the one on the first row. Bind off on the wrong side. Using the same method as the one on the second row. I'll demonstrate 2 more rows. Continue with the third row. Binding off 2 stitches at the beginning of this row. First, bind off 1 stitch. On the right side, knit and bind off. Then knit 1 stitch and bind off. Note: when binding off the last stitch, the stitch you're working on should be worked according to the chart. Sometimes the pattern is special, and it may not be a knit stitch here. Don't make a mistake. It's the same on the wrong side. Now I've bound off 2 stitches. Continue knitting this row to completion. Once finished, continue with the 4th row. At the beginning of this row, bind off 2 stitches. First, bind off 1 stitch. On the wrong side, purl and bind off. Then purl 1 stitch and bind off. That binds off 2 stitches. Continue knitting this row to completion. Now I've completed the 4th row. If you only need to bind off 1 stitch on each side, the method is the same as binding off the first stitch. This is the underarm bind off technique. With that, the main piece is explained. Next, we'll discuss the bordure. There are 2 bordures, Bordure 1 and Bordure 2. The methods for both bordures are identical. They just differ in the area being worked. Both start with picking up stitches. Then you knit back and forth in rows, followed by binding off. Finally, you need to match and sew together the last row with the first row. Bordure 1 is on the right side of the collar. Start picking up from the tip on the right side until the other side's tip position. For Bordure 2, at the beginning and ending sides, you need to pick up stitches where the collar meets the main piece. That's the area where Bordure 1 didn't have any stitches picked up. Start by picking up along one side from the collar and the main piece together. Then continue picking up along the edge of the main piece alone. When you reach the other side, pick up where the collar meets the main piece again. After picking up, continue knitting. When completed, align the last row with the first row. Note that when aligning, the knit texture should be facing outwards. Then use the overcast stitch method. Stitch together roughly corresponding positions of the 2 rows. There are no specific requirements for where you insert your needle here. Just make sure there are no obvious marks on the right side. After sewing together, fold the collar and the main piece in half. The folded area in the middle can be adjusted according to preference. Here, after folding, the brim of the collar should have a nice curve. Then find a few points to secure first. Leave some areas at both ends for pockets. Then start sewing from the side next to one pocket. Sew all the way to the side next to the other pocket. There are no fixed requirements for the sewing method here, as long as the fabric looks neat and flat after sewing. And there are no obvious sewing marks on the right side. Everyone, get this done. That completes the explanation of the bordure. Next, let's talk about the Chinese frogs. First, you need to knit the frog band, which is like this cord. Then loop it into the shape of the frog. Finally, attach it. Let's start by knitting the frog band, which is making the cord. Please watch the demonstration. Start by cable cast on. Usually, you cast on 3 or 4 stitches. The exact number of stitches to cast on depends on the pattern instructions. I'm casting on 4 stitches here. Pay attention to the pattern. Check if you need to leave a long yarn tail at the beginning. If there are no instructions, leaving 5 to 10 centimeters should be fine. You can choose your preferred method for casting on. After casting on, knit one by one accordingly. Once done, move this whole thing to the right side of the needle. Note that you don't turn your work. Then, directly use this yarn to knit from right to left. Knit the first stitch tighter. Next, you'll repeat this method each time. Move the loops to the right. And knit them in order. Repeat this process. Continue knitting. Until you reach the required length. After finishing, unless otherwise specified, leave about 15 centimeters of yarn tail before cutting the yarn. Start to bind off. Thread the yarn tail onto a needle. Then insert it from right to left through these loops. We can do this again. Tighten. Bind off completed. This is the method for working the cord. Once complete, shape the cord into a Chinese frog. Reserve about 20 centimeters at one end. Then loop it into a 8 shape. With a smaller hole on top. Then loop around the bottom hole twice. Leaving the top hole. And then insert the cord through the bottom hole. Tidy it up a bit. The small top hole is the buttonhole. You can check it against the button to see if the size fits. If it doesn't fit, you can adjust the cord you reserved at the beginning or redo the Chinese frog. Once you're sure, tie a knot at both ends of the Chinese frog. At this point, the shape of the Chinese frog is made. Finally, according to your wearing preference, sew the Chinese frog onto the collar. Diagonally above the pocket. On the other side, attach the button in the corresponding position. That concludes our explanation of the Chinese frogs and buttons. At this point, the entire process of making the shawl has been fully explained. If you have any questions during the process, don't hesitate to reach us via our website. Susan's Family, supporting your handwork experience, sharing the joy of life. Thank you for watching. See you in the next episode.